When a man first begins to think like a king, the most violent resistance does not come from the world, but from within himself. His habits rebel, his moral conditioning protests, his fear, trained since childhood to obey ceilings imposed by others, panics at the idea of standing above the crowd rather than within it. This inner resistance is the clearest proof that kingship is not a social title, but a psychological rupture. A peasant is not defined by poverty alone. He is defined by submission to invisible limits. A king is not defined by a crown. He is defined by the absence of internal permission-seeking. Machiavelli understood this truth centuries ago, not as philosophy, but as survival logic. Power does not reward virtue. It rewards clarity, decisiveness, and the ability to see the world as it is, not as it is preached to be. The peasant mind is trained to believe that life is a fair system overseen by moral accountants. Work hard, be good, obey rules, and reward will arrive. This belief is not naive by accident. It is cultivated deliberately. Societies require stability, and stability is maintained when the majority believes that patience is power, and obedience is wisdom. Kings cannot be manufactured at scale. Peasants can. Therefore, the first lesson in thinking like a king is the recognition that most of what you were taught was designed to keep you predictable, not powerful. The peasant waits to be chosen. The king chooses himself and dares the world to respond. A king does not ask whether he deserves power. That question alone disqualifies most men. Deserving is a moral concept. Power is a practical one. History does not ask who was most ethical. It remembers who prevailed. Machiavelli observed rulers who were cruel yet stable, deceptive yet admired, feared yet obeyed. He concluded something uncomfortable. People do not follow goodness. They follow strength dressed convincingly enough to appear legitimate. The peasant recoils at this truth because it threatens his moral self-image. The king accepts it because he understands that morality without leverage is decoration. From childhood, the peasant is trained to externalize authority. Parents, teachers, bosses, laws, traditions, trends, and eventually public opinion become the invisible masters shaping his choices. He asks, often unconsciously, "Is this allowed?" before asking, "Is this effective?" This single habit separates the ruled from the ruler. Kings do not ignore rules, but they never confuse rules with reality. Rules are tools used by those in power to maintain order. They are flexible to the powerful and rigid to the powerless. A king studies rules the way a general studies terrain, not to worship it, but to navigate, exploit, or bypass it when necessary. Fear is the currency of control, and the peasant is rich in it. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of exclusion, fear of instability, fear of being misunderstood. These fears are reinforced socially, ensuring conformity. The king experiences fear as well, but he does not negotiate with it. He treats fear as information, not instruction. Where the peasant asks, "What if this goes wrong?" the king asks, "What happens if I do nothing?" This inversion alone alters destiny. Most lives collapse not from bold mistakes, but from cautious stagnation. Machiavelli's greatest heresy was not cruelty, but realism. He stripped power of its romantic disguise and revealed it as a dynamic between perception and force. A king understands that people rarely react to truth directly. They react to narratives, symbols, and confidence. This is why appearances matter more than intentions. The peasant believes sincerity will save him. The king knows that sincerity without strategy is vulnerability. He learns to manage perception not because he is fake, but because he understands that reality is filtered through human bias. The king's mind is strategic rather than reactive. The peasant reacts emotionally to events, taking things personally, interpreting obstacles as insults or signs from fate. The king sees patterns. He studies cause and effect over time. He understands that people are predictable not because they are simple, but because they are driven by the same core motivations: security, status, and meaning. Machiavelli warned that a ruler who relies on love alone will be destroyed the moment affection turns. Love is conditional. Fear, when managed correctly, is reliable. This does not mean cruelty for its own sake. It means never surrendering leverage in exchange for approval. One of the most dangerous illusions of the peasant mind is the belief that power corrupts. This belief comforts the powerless by allowing them to feel morally superior. Machiavelli saw the inverse more clearly. Power reveals. It amplifies what already exists. Weak men become tyrants when given authority because their insecurity seeks control. Strong men become stable because they do not need to prove dominance at every moment. Thinking like a king requires confronting your own hunger for validation. Until you master that hunger, power will master you. A king does not rush to speak. Silence is one of his sharpest weapons. The peasant fills silence with explanations, defenses, and justifications, hoping to be understood. The king allows silence to pressure others into revealing themselves. He understands that information flows toward calm authority. Those who speak least often learn the most. Machiavelli observed that rulers who appeared thoughtful and reserved were assumed to be wise, even when they revealed little. Perception, again, outweighs substance in the early stages of power. The king's relationship with time is also different. The peasant thinks short-term because survival demands it. Immediate comfort, quick approval, fast rewards. The king extends his timeline. He sacrifices short-term comfort for long-term position. He plants seeds knowing he may not enjoy the harvest immediately. This patience is not passive. It is calculated. Machiavelli admired rulers who endured temporary unpopularity to secure lasting control. The crowd sees only the moment. The king sees the arc. Thinking like a king also means accepting loneliness. Power isolates. The higher you rise, the fewer people can relate to your perspective. The peasant seeks belonging. The king accepts separation. This does not mean cruelty or detachment from humanity. It means emotional independence. A ruler who needs to be liked cannot make hard decisions. Machiavelli repeatedly warned that leaders destroyed themselves by trying to satisfy everyone. The king understands that displeasing some is the price of direction. The peasant mind clings to consistency. The king embraces adaptability. What worked yesterday may fail tomorrow. Loyalty to outdated strategies is not honor. It is blindness. Machiavelli praised rulers who could change their nature with the times, appearing merciful when useful, ruthless when required, generous when strategic, and frugal when necessary. This fluidity offends moral purists but saves kingdoms. Rigidity feels virtuous. Flexibility wins wars. At the core of kingly thinking lies responsibility without excuse. The peasant blames circumstances, conspiracies, bad luck, or unfair systems. The king assumes responsibility even when events are not his fault. This assumption of responsibility is not guilt. It is power. If everything is someone else's fault, nothing is within your control. Machiavelli admired leaders who absorbed blame publicly while consolidating authority privately. They understood that perception of strength grows when responsibility is owned. A king does not fantasize about justice. He engineers outcomes. He knows that people rarely remember processes, only results. The peasant argues principles. The king delivers stability. This is why flawed rulers often endure, while virtuous idealists collapse. Reality rewards effectiveness. Machiavelli was not advising immorality for pleasure, but competence over illusion. A kingdom ruled by good intentions and weak execution is still a failed kingdom. To think like a king is to see yourself as a force rather than a subject. It is to abandon the need for permission, applause, and moral comfort. It is to understand that power is not evil, but neutrality amplified by will. Those who refuse to learn its mechanics will always be ruled by those who do. Machiavelli did not ask whether this was fair. He asked whether it was true. This first shift is the most painful and the most liberating. Once the illusion of fairness collapses, clarity emerges. You begin to see why certain men rise repeatedly while others remain resentful observers. You begin to recognize how narratives are used to pacify, how fear is disguised as virtue, how obedience is marketed as goodness. The peasant mind recoils from this vision. The king accepts it and begins to move deliberately within it. This is not a call to cruelty, nor a rejection of conscience. It is a rejection of naivete. A king can choose mercy only when he has the capacity for force. A peasant's kindness is often weakness disguised as virtue. Machiavelli respected mercy backed by power, not helpless goodwill. The difference is subtle but absolute. The second stage of thinking like a king begins when a man realizes that power is never given in response to merit, but extracted through positioning. The peasant believes effort is the currency of advancement. He works harder, waits longer, hopes louder. The king understands that effort without leverage is exhaustion disguised as virtue. Machiavelli observed courts filled with diligent men who remained invisible and idle men, who ruled entire regions. The difference was not intelligence or morality, but placement. Power flows toward those who stand where decisions converge, not those who sweat far from influence. The peasant asks, "What should I do?" The king asks, "Where should I stand?" This single shift restructures behavior. Most people drown in activity because they are poorly positioned. They serve systems instead of shaping them. They chase approval from those who gain nothing by granting it. Kings reverse this dynamic. They place themselves near scarcity, scarce skills, scarce access, scarce trust, scarce decisiveness. Wherever scarcity exists, leverage forms. Machiavelli advised rulers to control key gateways rather than micromanage outcomes. Whoever controls access controls negotiation. A king understands hierarchy instinctively. The peasant pretends hierarchy is imaginary or unjust. This denial does not erase hierarchy. It only blinds him to its mechanics. Every group, whether political, corporate, social, or cultural, organizes itself around power gradients. Someone decides, someone influences, someone obeys. The king studies these gradients without resentment. He identifies who truly decides, who merely speaks, and who only appears powerful. Machiavelli warned against confusing titles with authority. Many wear crowns without power. Many hold power without crowns. The peasant wastes energy fighting visible enemies. The king watches invisible alliances. Influence rarely announces itself. It moves quietly through favors, obligations, reputation, and fear. A king builds networks before he needs them. The peasant waits until desperation forces him to ask. Machiavelli admired rulers who distributed calculated generosity early, creating silent debts that matured into loyalty. Generosity, when strategic, is investment. When emotional, it is charity. A king never assumes loyalty is permanent. Loyalty is rented, not owned. It lasts only as long as interests align or fear outweighs betrayal. The peasant believes loyalty is moral. He is shocked when it collapses. The king expects erosion and prepares redundancies. Machiavelli repeatedly emphasized that mercenaries and allies are unreliable because their commitment is shallow. A king builds systems that do not collapse when one pillar fails. Redundancy is not paranoia. It is intelligence. Control of narrative is central to kingship. The peasant believes truth will defend itself. The king knows truth must be framed to survive. People do not remember facts. They remember stories that flatter their identity or soothe their fear. Machiavelli instructed rulers to appear virtuous even when acting ruthlessly. This was not hypocrisy for its own sake, but understanding human perception. People judge outcomes emotionally first, rationally later. A king manages the emotional interpretation before the rational debate begins. The peasant exposes his intentions too early. He announces plans, seeks validation, invites interference. The king reveals intentions only when movement is already irreversible. Silence protects strategy. Machiavelli admired leaders who spoke ambiguously, allowing others to project their hopes or fears onto them. This ambiguity created leverage. When people are unsure of your limits, they negotiate cautiously. When they know your entire plan, they resist efficiently. A king understands that enemies are inevitable. The peasant seeks universal acceptance and is destabilized by opposition. The king anticipates resistance and incorporates it into strategy. Machiavelli noted that attempting to avoid enemies often creates weakness. Clear direction always creates friction. A ruler who tries to please all sides ends up trusted by none. The king chooses enemies carefully and ensures they are fragmented, distracted, or dependent. The illusion of fairness dissolves completely at this stage. The peasant still clings to the hope that systems will correct injustice. The king accepts that systems protect themselves. Laws are interpreted by those with authority. Rules bend for insiders and harden for outsiders. Machiavelli did not advise rebellion against systems blindly. He advised understanding who benefits from their existence. Once benefits are clear, pressure points appear. Power is rarely destroyed. It is transferred. A king studies human weakness without contempt. He knows most people are driven by fear of loss rather than desire for gain. This makes them conservative, predictable, and controllable. Machiavelli observed that threats are more motivating than rewards. But excessive threat breeds rebellion. Balance is essential. A king applies pressure subtly, allowing people to believe they are choosing freely while guiding their options. Freedom of choice is often an illusion curated by those in control. The peasant confuses busyness with importance. The king values stillness. He creates space to observe. Observation reveals rhythms. Who speaks when certain people enter a room? Who defers unconsciously? Who interrupts without consequence? These signals expose true hierarchy. Machiavelli treated courts like living organisms, reading their symptoms rather than their proclamations. The king trains his attention to these subtleties. Power speaks softly. A king also understands timing. Acting too early invites resistance. Acting too late surrenders initiative. The peasant reacts when emotion peaks. The king waits until conditions ripen. Machiavelli praised rulers who appeared patient until a decisive moment, then moved with overwhelming speed. Sudden action destabilizes opponents psychologically. They scramble while the king consolidates. Self-control separates rulers from subjects. The peasant vents frustration publicly, revealing insecurity. The king regulates emotions strictly. Anger is used selectively, displayed when it serves purpose, hidden when it exposes weakness. Machiavelli warned that uncontrolled emotion erodes authority. People follow those who appear internally stable. Stability signals safety, even when decisions are harsh. A king never over-explains. Explanation invites debate. Authority does not argue, it states. The peasant justifies himself endlessly, hoping logic will protect him. The king understands that confidence often substitutes for logic in social hierarchies. This is not ignorance. It is economy. Excessive explanation signals doubt. Doubt invites challenge. At this level, the king begins to detach identity from role. The peasant's identity is fragile. Criticism feels personal. The king treats roles as masks worn for effect. Praise and blame pass through him without defining him. Machiavelli admired rulers who could absorb public hatred temporarily without internal collapse. Emotional resilience is strategic armor. Most importantly, the king abandons the fantasy of control over people and focuses on control over structures. People are chaotic. Structures endure. Incentives shape behavior more reliably than speeches. Machiavelli advised altering conditions rather than pleading for loyalty. Change the reward and behavior follows. Moral appeals are weak compared to material alignment. The third stage of thinking like a king begins when a man understands that power is maintained, not by constant force, but by controlled dependence. The peasant believes power must be proven repeatedly through effort, argument, or aggression. He exhausts himself trying to demonstrate worth. The king learns the opposite lesson. The less he needs to prove, the more authority he radiates. Machiavelli observed that rulers who governed through structure and expectation rather than impulse lasted longer and faced fewer revolts. Stability, not intensity, is the true signal of dominance. Dependence is the quiet architecture of control. A king does not aim to be loved universally or feared constantly. He aims to be necessary. When people depend on your decisions, your access, or your protection, loyalty becomes practical rather than emotional. Machiavelli advised rulers to make themselves indispensable to the functioning of the state. Remove the king, and confusion follows. Replaceable leaders invite replacement. Necessary leaders endure. The peasant tries to be useful through effort. The king becomes useful through scarcity. He limits access to himself, to resources, to decisions. Scarcity increases value. Unlimited availability erodes authority. Machiavelli warned against rulers who were too accessible, too generous, too familiar. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort breeds disregard. Distance, when controlled, preserves respect. A king understands that fear, when excessive, creates hatred, and hatred eventually produces rebellion. Fear must be precise, predictable, and restrained. The peasant lashes out emotionally, creating chaos. The king applies consequences consistently. Predictable punishment stabilizes behavior more effectively than unpredictable rage. Machiavelli emphasized that cruelty, if necessary, should be swift and finite, not continuous. Lingering oppression exhausts both ruler and subject. Reputation becomes a fortress at this stage. The king invests heavily in how he is perceived, not through propaganda alone, but through patterns of behavior. People trust what repeats. A ruler known for decisiveness is obeyed faster. One known for hesitation is tested endlessly. Machiavelli understood that reputation precedes presence. Long before a king enters a room, expectations enter first. He shapes those expectations deliberately. The peasant confuses transparency with honesty. The king understands opacity. He reveals enough to appear trustworthy, but never enough to be predictable. Predictability invites exploitation. Machiavelli admired rulers who allowed others to believe they understood them fully, while holding reserves of unpredictability. Controlled mystery creates caution in adversaries and respect in allies. At this stage, the king no longer fights every battle. He chooses which conflicts define him. The peasant responds to every provocation, draining energy and status. The king ignores insults that do not threaten structure. Silence in the face of trivial attacks signals confidence. Machiavelli noted that rulers who reacted to every criticism appeared insecure, while those who remained unmoved elevated themselves above petty disputes. A king also understands the power of delegation. Control does not mean doing everything personally. The peasant hoards tasks to feel important. The king distributes responsibility strategically, allowing others to invest their identity into his success. Machiavelli warned, however, that delegation without oversight breeds betrayal. The king balances trust with verification. He creates competition among subordinates so that no single figure accumulates enough power to challenge him. The management of elites becomes critical. Masses are moved by emotion. Elites are moved by interest. A peasant leader panders to crowds and ignores power brokers. A king does the opposite. He secures the elite first, knowing that stability flows downward. Machiavelli advised rulers to neutralize or co-opt powerful families and institutions early. Unchecked elites become rival centers of authority. A king never allows resentment to ferment unnoticed. He studies dissent quietly. Suppressed resentment explodes violently. Addressed resentment dissipates. Machiavelli observed that wise rulers allowed limited expression of dissatisfaction to prevent unified rebellion. Total silence is dangerous. Controlled release preserves order. The peasant fears criticism. The king manages it. Self-image shifts permanently here. The king stops seeing himself as a moral actor seeking approval and starts seeing himself as a stabilizing force. Decisions are judged by consequence, not intention. This perspective is heavy, but it is honest. Machiavelli accepted that leadership often requires choosing the least destructive option, rather than the most virtuous one. The peasant seeks purity. The king seeks continuity. At this level, the king also confronts isolation fully. Trust becomes selective. Intimacy narrows. Machiavelli warned that excessive trust invites downfall, yet total suspicion creates paralysis. The king maintains a small inner circle, bound by shared interest rather than sentiment alone. Loyalty is reinforced through benefit, fear, and identity combined. One without the others is fragile. The illusion of permanent control dissolves as well. Power is dynamic. What is secured today must be reinforced tomorrow. The king does not relax into complacency. He builds systems that refresh authority automatically: laws, incentives, rituals, symbols. Machiavelli admired rulers who institutionalized their power, making obedience habitual rather than forced. Habit is stronger than fear. The peasant seeks validation in visible success. The king measures success in reduced resistance. When systems run smoothly, when decisions face minimal opposition, when obedience feels natural, power is mature. This maturity is quiet and often invisible. Machiavelli understood that the strongest rulers appeared almost ordinary because chaos had been engineered out of their environment. A king also learns to exit conflicts strategically. Not every victory requires humiliation of the defeated. Excessive victory breeds future enemies. Machiavelli advised allowing opponents a dignified retreat when possible. Humiliated men plot revenge. Satisfied men seek survival. Mercy, when calculated, prevents long-term instability. At this stage, emotion is almost entirely subordinated to function. This does not mean the king becomes inhuman. It means humanity is filtered through responsibility. Personal desires yield to structural necessity. Machiavelli believed that rulers who prioritized personal morality over public stability endangered their states. The burden of kingship is choosing outcomes that others are unwilling to carry. The final stage of thinking like a king begins when a man accepts the most difficult truth of all. Power is temporary, perception is fragile, and permanence is an illusion. The peasant avoids this truth and clings to hope, legacy, and promises of fairness beyond his lifetime. The king confronts impermanence directly and uses it to sharpen judgment. Machiavelli understood that rulers fall not because power abandons them suddenly, but because they forget that it can. Complacency, not opposition, is the true executioner of kings. At this stage, the king's focus shifts from acquisition and maintenance to succession and insulation. The peasant lives as if tomorrow will resemble today. The king assumes tomorrow will challenge today. He prepares structures that outlive his direct control. Machiavelli warned that rulers who centralized everything within themselves created brittle systems. When they fell, everything collapsed. Wise kings distribute authority carefully, embedding their influence into institutions, norms, and expectations that persist even in their absence. The king no longer identifies with the throne. Identity attachment is dangerous. When a man becomes the role, he defends his ego rather than the state. The peasant takes attacks personally. The king treats them as signals. Machiavelli admired leaders who could sacrifice personal pride to preserve stability. Pride is expensive. Detachment is economical. A king who can step back sees more clearly than one who must always stand at the center. Legacy becomes a strategic question, not a sentimental one. The peasant wants to be remembered as good. The king wants to be remembered as necessary. Machiavelli did not romanticize legacy. He understood that history is written by survivors, not saints. A ruler's reputation after death depends less on intention than on whether the structure he built continued to function. Chaos erases virtue. Stability preserves memory. At this level, the king understands the cyclical nature of power. Rise, consolidation, decay, replacement. These cycles cannot be eliminated, only delayed and shaped. The peasant denies cycles and is shocked by decline. The king anticipates decay and prepares renewal mechanisms. He rotates elites, refreshes alliances, reforms institutions before collapse forces reform violently. Machiavelli praised rulers who reformed their states proactively, even at the cost of short-term unrest, to avoid catastrophic collapse later. The king also accepts that fear and love are tools, not identities. Earlier stages taught balance. Now balance becomes instinctive. He no longer debates which is better. He applies whichever preserves order in the moment. Machiavelli emphasized adaptability above all virtues. Fixed identity is a liability in a changing world. The king becomes fluid without becoming erratic, consistent without becoming rigid. One of the most misunderstood aspects of kingship is restraint. True power does not express itself fully because it does not need to. The peasant uses every ounce of authority immediately, intoxicated by control. The king withholds. Restraint creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates caution. Machiavelli observed that rulers who revealed the full extent of their power invited coalitions against them. Those who appeared strong but restrained allowed opponents to underestimate or hesitate. At this stage, the king's relationship with morality is settled. He no longer debates whether actions are good or bad in abstract terms. He evaluates consequences within context. This does not make him immoral. It makes him responsible. Machiavelli never argued that rulers should enjoy cruelty. He argued that rulers must accept moral burden when necessary. The peasant seeks moral comfort. The king accepts moral weight. Isolation deepens here, but so does clarity. The king understands that no one fully shares his perspective. Advisors offer input, not absolution. Responsibility remains singular. Machiavelli warned that rulers who sought emotional relief through confession to advisors, often revealed weaknesses that later became leverage against them. The king listens widely but decides alone. Control of symbols becomes crucial in this final phase. Rituals, ceremonies, language, myths, these elements bind people emotionally to structures. The peasant dismisses symbols as superficial. The king understands they are psychological anchors. Machiavelli observed that states collapse not only when armies fail, but when belief dissolves. Symbols maintain belief. Belief maintains order. The king also learns when to withdraw. There is power in timely exit. Staying too long erodes legitimacy. The peasant clings to position until removal becomes violent. The king senses when presence to stabilize is more than it stabilizes. Machiavelli admired rulers who abdicated strategically or reduced visibility, while retaining influence through proxies. Power does not always sit on the throne. Often it stands just behind it. At this level, the king measures success not in expansion, but in resilience. How well does the system absorb shocks? How quickly does order restore itself after disruption? The peasant celebrates growth. The king prioritizes survival. Growth without resilience invites collapse. Machiavelli understood that enduring states were not those that expanded endlessly, but those that adapted intelligently. The final transformation is internal. The hunger that once drove ambition quiets, not because desire is gone, but because it is satisfied by mastery rather than conquest. The peasant always wants more. The king wants stability. This calm is often mistaken for weakness by outsiders. It is not. It is confidence that no longer seeks validation. By the end of this stage, the man who thinks like a king no longer romanticizes power. He respects it. He no longer fears loss excessively, because he has already integrated impermanence into his strategy. He knows that control is a temporary stewardship, not an entitlement. This acceptance paradoxically makes him more formidable. Those who fear loss act desperately. Those who accept it act precisely. Machiavelli's final lesson was never written as a command, but it echoes through his observations. The greatest rulers were not those who believed themselves chosen by fate, but those who understood themselves as instruments of circumstance and shaped circumstance in return. They did not ask for loyalty. They engineered alignment. They did not seek justice. They produced order. They did not rely on virtue. They relied on understanding. Thinking like a king is not about domination for pleasure or cruelty for ego. It is about seeing the world without illusion and acting without apology within that vision. The peasant seeks comfort in belief. The king seeks clarity in reality. One waits to be protected. The other becomes the structure that protection depends on. When this mindset settles fully, something quiet but permanent changes. You no longer envy rulers or resent systems. You study them. You no longer feel outraged by unfairness. You account for it. You no longer ask who deserves power. You ask who understands it. And in that understanding, whether or not you ever wear a crown, you stop thinking like a subject forever.